The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the valley until the very air seemed to shimmer and warp. Saul felt it in the sweat that slicked the handle of his axe, in the dry rasp of his own breathing. He worked with a rhythm born of solitude, the steady chunk of steel into pine, a conversation with the silent, watchful mountains that ringed his claim. He had built this place with his hands, raised the cabin from the forest floor, cleared the stony earth for a garden that fought stubbornly for life. It was a quiet kingdom, his and his alone. That was about to change. He'd sent a letter and a pouch of gold dust down the mountain with a traveling merchant months ago. The response had been a single, clipped note from a man in the city, a father eager to unburden himself. A daughter. Unwed. Healthy. The words were transactional, like ordering a new plow. Saul hadn't thought much on it beyond the practical need. The silence in the cabin had grown too loud, the winters too long. He was a large man, built on the scale of the mountains themselves, with a thick beard and hair that fell past his shoulders, and he knew the sight of him could be unsettling. He expected someone meek, someone already broken by life who would be grateful for the shelter of his roof and the food from his table. He did not expect the woman who stood beside the merchant's tired-looking mule. She was small, but stood as straight as the pines behind her, her gaze level and unblinking. There was no fear in her eyes, not the kind he expected. He saw something else, a deep, guarded stillness, like a doe listening for the snap of a twig that means life or death. The merchant muttered a name, Lynn, took the last of his payment, and was gone before the dust settled, eager to be away. She held a single, small bundle tied with twine. She did not look at the cabin, or the mountains, or the garden. She looked only at him, her eyes dark and assessing, and in that moment, Saul understood that the simple arrangement he had made was not simple at all. He had not bought a wife, he had inherited a stranger's secret. Lynn followed the giant of a man into the cabin, the interior dark and cool after the relentless sun. It smelled of pine smoke, leather, and something else, the clean, sharp scent of loneliness. The space was brutally functional, stripped of any softness. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed built into the far wall. Every object looked as if it had been made by the same hands that had felled the trees. There was no artifice here, no deception. The place was exactly what it was, just like the man. His size was overwhelming, his presence filling the small room until the air felt thin. Yet he moved with a quiet economy, a lack of wasted motion that spoke of immense strength held in careful check. He gestured toward the table. Sit. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding deep in the earth. She did not sit. She placed her bundle on the floor and surveyed the room again, her mind cataloguing exits, potential weapons, the sturdiness of the door. Her father's final words had been a curse, spat in a language this man would not understand, be grateful. Here, no one will find you, but her father had always underestimated the greed of men. Someone would always come looking. She had lived with that certainty for a year, a cold stone in her gut. She turned back to the man, Saul. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. She had to establish the terms of her existence here, however temporary it might be. I can work, she said, her voice clear, betraying none of the exhaustion that clung to her bones. I will earn my keep. He looked from her small frame to the stacked cords of firewood outside, to the vast, demanding landscape. A flicker of something, pity? Doubt, crossed his face before being extinguished. The well is there, he said, pointing a thumb toward the door. Water needs fetching before evening. It wasn't a command so much as a statement of fact, a simple truth of this life. He was testing her, she knew. He was measuring her worth in buckets of water and stacks of firewood. She gave a single, sharp nod, picked up the wooden buckets by the door, and walked out into the oppressive heat, her back straight, leaving him alone in the suffocating quiet of his house. Days bled into a week, then 2, settling into a tense, silent rhythm. They moved around each other like wary animals, speaking only when necessary. The stove is hot. There is a storm coming from the west. The deer are moving down the slopes. Saul watched her. He had expected tears, complaints, the brittle fragility of a city-bred woman. Instead, he saw a relentless capacity for work. She learned the rhythms of the homestead with a fierce, quiet determination. She hauled water, tended the garden, mended his torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was not fragile, she was forged from something hard and unyielding. But the watchfulness never left her. Every time a hawk cried overhead or the wind rustled the pines too suddenly, her head would lift, her body would go taut, her gaze fixed on the long, winding track that led down the mountain. She was listening for something. She was waiting. One afternoon, he saw them first, 3 riders, dark shapes against the shimmering haze at the edge of his property. They were not prospectors or trappers. They sat their horses with the lazy arrogance of men who were paid to be dangerous. Saul picked up his rifle, the weight of it familiar and steadying in his hands, and walked out onto the porch. Lynn had already seen them. She stood frozen in the garden, a handheld trowel clutched in her fist, her face a pale, stark mask. He saw real fear in her then, cold and absolute, and it angered him. This was his land. His peace. He walked to the edge of the clearing, the rifle held loosely at his side. The lead rider, a man with a thin smile and dead eyes, urged his horse forward. "This is the Miller claim," the man asked, though it wasn't a question. "My name is Fletcher." Saul said nothing, letting the silence stretch. "We represent the railroad," Fletcher continued, his smile widening. "We're buying out all the claims in this valley. Made a generous offer down in the town. Figured we'd ride up and extend it to you personally." Saul knew a lie when he heard one. The railroad was 100 miles south. "This land's not for sale," he said, his voice flat. Fletcher's gaze drifted past him, toward the cabin, toward the small figure of Lynn in the garden. "Everything's for sale," he said softly. "Sometimes you just don't know the price yet. We'll be back." They turned their horses and rode away, their departure as unhurried and confident as their arrival. When Saul turned back, Lynn was gone. He found her inside the cabin, scrubbing the rough tabletop with a frantic energy, her knuckles white. She would not look at him. They did not speak of the riders. The silence in the cabin thickened, no longer just the quiet of strangers but something heavier, charged with unspoken questions. Saul cleaned his rifle by the firelight that night, the methodical scrape and click of metal on metal the only sound. Lynn sat at the table, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze lost in the flickering flames. The pretense of their arrangement had been stripped away. He was not just a husband, and she was not just a wife. He was a man defending his home, and she was the reason it was under threat. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his gut. The men weren't here for his land, not really. They were here for her. The next day, they came back, as Fletcher had promised. This time there were 5 of them, and they didn't stop at the edge of the property. They rode into the clearing as if they owned it, their horses tearing up the soil in Lynn's carefully tended garden. Saul met them on the porch again, his stance wider, his rifle now held across his chest. "I told you," Saul said, his voice low and dangerous. "It's not for sale." Fletcher ignored him. He dismounted, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. "We know she's in there," he said, his voice casual. "Her father sends his regards. He made a deal with my employer that he failed to honor. She is the collateral." The world seemed to shrink for Lynn, listening from behind the door, the words striking her like blows. Collateral. A thing. Not a person. The lie of her escape, the thin hope of a new life, it all crumbled to dust. She had not been saved, she had been moved from one cage to another, and now the keepers of the first had come to reclaim their property. Fletcher took a step toward the porch. "Send her out. We have no quarrel with you, mountain man." A shot suddenly cracked through the air, splintering the porch rail inches from Fletcher's head. It wasn't from Saul. It came from the trees to the east. A warning. Fletcher and his men scrambled for cover, returning fire into the woods. The clearing erupted into chaos. In that violent, terrifying moment, Saul kicked the door open, grabbed Lynn by the arm, and pulled her back into the relative safety of the cabin, slamming the heavy door and dropping the bar. Gunshots echoed outside. He pushed her toward the floor, his body shielding hers. "Stay down," he growled. The first wave of danger had passed, but the truth was now trapped in the cabin with them, raw and unavoidable. He looked down at her, his face grim in the dim light. "Who are they?" She finally met his eyes, the terror giving way to a stark, desolate honesty. "They are here for me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "My father sold me twice." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating as the gunsmoke that was beginning to seep through the cracks in the walls. Saul stared down at her, the pieces clicking into place with brutal clarity. The guardedness, the constant watching of the trail, the cold fear when Fletcher had appeared. She wasn't just a woman sold into marriage, she was cargo, a debt to be collected. His land, his home, was nothing more than a temporary hiding place that had failed. He felt a surge of cold fury, at her father, at Fletcher, at her for bringing this storm to his door. He had wanted peace, and she had brought a war. He moved away from her, his large frame seeming to crowd the small space with his anger. He checked the rifle, his movements stiff and economical. "Why?" he asked, not looking at her. "My father was a gambler," Lynn said to the floorboards, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He played cards with a powerful man in the city. He lost everything. Then he wagered something that was not his to give. A contract for labours on the railroad, a contract that belonged to that man. My father took the money and ran, and he sent me here, to you. He thought the mountains would hide me." She finally looked up, her eyes dark with a shame that was not her own. "That man, Fletcher's employer, he doesn't just want his money back. He wants to make an example of my father's dishonesty." Saul let out a harsh breath. He was a pawn in a rich man's game, his homestead the board. He could throw her out. He could give Fletcher what he wanted and perhaps they would leave him be. The thought was a bitter poison. He looked at the door, at the solid oak he had shaped and hung himself. He looked at the stone hearth where he had cooked his solitary meals. He looked at her, small and fierce and cornered. She had been used and discarded by everyone. He would not be another one. "They will burn the place down," she said quietly, as if reading his mind. "They will not stop, let them try," Saul grunted. The decision was made. It wasn't about her, not entirely. It was about the line Fletcher had crossed. This was his ground. He went to the window, peering carefully through a crack in the shutter. The shooting from the woods had stopped. A third party? Or just a warning? It didn't matter. The enemy was in his clearing. "That back window is weak," he said, his voice all business now. "We need to brace it. And we need more water." The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. They were no longer strangers. They were a garrison of two. The afternoon sun beat down on the cabin, baking the wood until it creaked. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The initial chaos had subsided into a waiting game. Saul could hear Fletcher's men moving in the trees, their voices carrying on the still air, low, confident murmurs. They were settling in for a siege. "They think they can wait us out," Saul said, his voice a low rumble. He was wedged against the far wall, his rifle resting on the sill of a shuttered window, a narrow slit giving him a view of the western approach. Lynn was on the other side of the room, doing the same. She wasn't holding a weapon, but she had a small hand mirror, angling it just so to catch a sliver of the clearing he couldn't see. Her competence was unnerving and deeply practical. She saw things he missed, the way a shadow shifted unnaturally, the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. They moved together with a grim, unspoken understanding. He was the strength, she was the eyes. The first real assault came without warning. A volley of shots tore through the shutters on the east side, sending splinters of wood flying into the room. Saul returned fire, the roar of his rifle deafening in the enclosed space. Glass shattered. A bullet thudded into the log wall just above Lynn's head. She didn't flinch, only shifted her position slightly. "Two of them," she said, her voice tight but steady. "Moving toward the well, I see them." The world shrank to the confines of the cabin, to the smell of gunpowder and hot metal, the sound of labored breathing and splintering wood. Time lost its meaning, measured only in the space between gunshots. They were a machine, a single entity focused on survival. He would fire, reload, and she would be there, pressing fresh cartridges into his hand, her small, steady fingers working in the dim light. He saw a flash of movement near the woodpile. He fired. A cry of pain echoed from outside, quickly silenced. One down. But there were more. He felt a strange sense of detachment, the violence becoming a grim, necessary chore, like chopping wood or skinning a deer. Then he saw it in her mirror, a man, crawling low through the tall grass of the untended back garden, heading for the weak window they hadn't had time to properly brace. Back window, Saul barked. He turned, bringing his rifle around, but it was too late. The man was already there, a dark shape smashing through the brittle frame. He tumbled into the room, a pistol in his hand, his eyes wild. He was young, barely more than a boy, and fear made him reckless. Saul was too far away, his rifle too long to bring to bear in the tight space. The man raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Lynn. Everything slowed. The motes of dust dancing in the slivers of light. The sound of Saul's own heart hammering in his chest. Lynn didn't scream. She moved. With a speed that seemed impossible, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and lunged, not at the man, but at his gun hand. The poker connected with his wrist with a sickening crack. The pistol flew from his grasp, clattering across the floorboards. The man howled in pain and rage, stumbling back, clutching his broken arm. He stared at her with disbelief, his attack thwarted not by a bullet, but by a piece of fireplace iron wielded with vicious precision. But the momentary victory was short-lived. The man, snarling, drew a long knife with his good hand and charged at her. Saul was moving then, crossing the room in 2 great strides, his body a battering ram. He slammed into the attacker, driving him hard against the log wall. The impact shook the entire cabin. Saul was a force of nature unleashed, all his contained strength exploding in a torrent of focused violence. But the man was desperate. As they grappled, the knife flashed, and Saul grunted, a sharp intake of breath. The man fell, unconscious from a blow that would have killed a smaller man, but the knife remained, its blade buried deep in the muscle of Saul's left shoulder. Blood, dark and shocking, began to well up, staining his shirt. He staggered back, his face pale beneath his beard, and looked at Lynn. The immediate threat was over, but the cost was written in his blood. She rushed to his side, her face a mask of horror and something else, a fierce, protective urgency that tore down the last of her walls. The world outside the cabin seemed to fade away. The sporadic gunfire, the shouts of Fletcher's men, it all became a distant, unimportant noise. The only reality was the dim light of the cabin, the coppery smell of blood, and the huge man leaning heavily against the wall, his breathing ragged. Lynn ripped a strip of cloth from her own tunic, her hands working quickly, surely. She had to get the knife out. She had to stop the bleeding. "Sit," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. He sank onto one of the chairs, his eyes glassy with pain. She gripped the handle of the knife. It was lodged deep in the thick muscle of his shoulder. "This will hurt," she said, a foolish, useless statement. He just grunted, his jaw tight. She pulled, a smooth, steady motion. Saul roared, a deep, guttural sound of pure agony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The knife came free. Blood flowed in earnest now, a terrifying tide. She pressed the wad of cloth against the wound, putting all her weight into it, her small hand stained crimson. He had taken this wound for her. The realization was a physical blow, more stunning than any gunshot. He had placed his body between her and the blade without a moment's hesitation. All her life, she had been a bargaining chip, an object to be sold or hidden. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever bled for her. The debt was absolute, and it was paid in a currency she had never been offered before. "Hold this," she said, guiding his good hand to the makeshift bandage. Press hard. She moved to the hearth, stoked the embers of the fire, and heated the tip of the fireplace poker until it glowed a dull, angry red. He watched her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with understanding. He knew what was coming. When she returned with the glowing iron, he simply nodded, bracing himself. The hiss of cauterized flesh and the sharp, acrid smell filled the small room. He didn't cry out this time, just a long, shuddering groan that tore from deep in his chest. When it was over, he slumped in the chair, sweat beading on his forehead. Outside, a new sound began, the hungry crackle of fire. Fletcher, impatient, had chosen his final weapon. Smoke began to curl under the door. They were trapped between the fire and the gunman. The smoke thickened, acrid and blinding. The heat against the cabin walls grew from a gentle warmth to an oppressive, suffocating force. The crackle of burning pine was punctuated by the triumphant shouts of Fletcher's men outside. They had traded bullets for an inferno, certain their work was done. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up Lynn's throat, but she forced it down. She looked at Saul. He was struggling to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were clear, fiercely alive. The fire had not broken him, it had focused him. The root cellar, he rasped, coughing as he pointed to a heavy trapdoor in the floor she had mistaken for a simple patch. The outside hatch is on the north side, near the creek bed. They won't be watching it. It was a desperate plan, their only plan. Together, they heaved at the heavy wooden door. It came open with a groan of protest, revealing a square of blackness that smelled of damp earth and potatoes. Cool air rushed up to meet them. Saul gestured for her to go first. She hesitated, looking at his wounded shoulder, at the blood still seeping through the crude bandage. Go, he insisted, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. She scrambled down the rickety ladder into the cool, dark space. He followed, his movements clumsy with pain, pulling the trapdoor shut just as a section of the roof overhead collapsed in a shower of embers and flame. They were plunged into absolute darkness, the roar of the fire above them a terrifying, muffled thunder. They were alive, but they were buried. Saul fumbled in the dark, his hand finding a small ledge where he kept a tin of matches and a lantern. His first attempt failed, the matchstick breaking in his trembling hand. The second flared to life, a tiny, defiant star in the oppressive blackness. He lit the lantern, and the small cellar was filled with a flickering, golden light. It revealed a small space, walls lined with shelves of preserved goods, the air still and cool. For a moment, it was a sanctuary. But the sound of the fire still raged above them. They had only traded one trap for another. Saul led the way to the far end of the cellar, to a smaller, angled door braced with iron. He put his good shoulder to it and pushed. It held fast, swollen shut with damp. He pushed again, a groan of effort and pain tearing from his lips. It didn't budge. Lynn put her shoulder next to his. Together, she said. They pushed, a single unit of desperation and will, their breathing synchronized, their muscles straining. The wood groaned, splintered, and then burst outward with a spray of dirt and rotten leaves. They tumbled out into the cool night air, into the deep shadows of the creek bed, gulping in the clean, sweet air like drowning swimmers. The cabin was a blazing pyre against the night sky, a monument to the life Saul had built, now being consumed by another man's greed. Fletcher and his men were silhouetted against the flames, watching their handiwork, laughing. They were distracted, confident, their backs turned. Saul and Lynn faded into the deeper darkness of the forest, ghosts escaping their own grave. Dawn broke grey and smoky. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind the blackened skeleton of the cabin, a dark scar on the mountainside. The clearing was empty. Fletcher and his men were gone, believing their job finished, their targets reduced to ash. Saul and Lynn sat among the rocks above the creek, watching the sun rise over the ruin of their home. They were a portrait of exhaustion. Saul's face was drawn and pale, his wounded shoulder a constant, throbbing agony. Lynn was covered in soot and grime, her borrowed clothes torn, but her eyes were clear. The fear was gone, burned away in the crucible of the night, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. They had survived. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't the tense, wary quiet of their first days together, it was a shared space, hollowed out by violence and loss, and now filled with a new, unspoken understanding. He had lost everything his hands had built. The cabin, the furniture, the years of solitary labor, all gone. He looked at his hands, calloused and capable, and felt a profound, aching emptiness. "I am sorry," Lynn said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the morning breeze. "This was my fault." Saul turned to look at her. He saw not the source of his ruin, but the reason for his survival. Alone, he would have fought and died in that cabin. With her, he had fought and lived. He had seen her spirit, the unbending core of her that refused to break. She was not collateral. She was a survivor, forged in a fire hotter than the one that had taken his home. "No," he said, his voice rough. "The fault belongs to the men who lit the match." He looked back at the smoldering ruins. Wood and stone can be replaced. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of a profound choice. He was not mourning what was lost, he was measuring what remained. And what remained was the two of them, sitting on a rock in the smoky dawn, with nothing left but each other. He had fought for his land, but in the end, he had fought for her. The realization settled in him, not with a shock, but with the quiet certainty of a mountain settling onto its foundation. A strange sort of peace descended upon him, even amidst the devastation. He had been alone for so long, guarding his quiet kingdom. Now, his walls were gone, and he was not alone. The quiet that followed was comfortable, and earned peace. In the aftermath of the battle, in the shared space of survival, something new and fragile was beginning to take root in the scorched earth of their lives. They spent the next days in a haze of labor. The immediate threat was gone, but the long, slow work of rebuilding had begun. They salvaged what they could from the ashes, a few cast iron pots, warped but usable, a handful of tools with charred handles, the stone hearth, which stood like a monument amidst the debris. They slept in a makeshift shelter of pine boughs and salvaged canvas, the nights cold, the stars unnervously bright without a roof to block them. They worked from sunup to sundown, clearing the rubble, felling new trees. The shared physical toll was a balm, a way to process the violence without words. He taught her how to use a saw, how to notch logs, and she learned quickly, her movements precise and efficient. She, in turn, showed him how to find edible roots and herbs in the forest, things his solitary eyes had never noticed. They were building more than a cabin, they were building a new life from the ground up. Each log they placed a testament to their shared will. One evening, they sat by the fire, the frame of a new, smaller structure rising behind them. His shoulder was healing, the wound a puckered, angry scar. She was cleaning a rifle, not his, but one they had taken from the man in the cabin, her movements methodical and sure. He watched the firelight play on her face, softening the hard lines of exhaustion and stress. The wary, haunted look she'd arrived with was gone, replaced by a quiet competence, a sense of belonging that she seemed to wear as comfortably as her worn clothes. He realized he no longer saw the stranger his money had bought. He saw Lynn. He saw the woman who had faced down a gunman with a fireplace poker, who had held a glowing iron to his flesh to save him, who had pushed alongside him to break them out of their tomb. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines. It was a silence he knew would never again feel lonely. She finished cleaning the weapon, setting it aside carefully. She looked from the rising frame of the new cabin to the vast, dark expanse of the mountains, then back to him. Her expression was serious, her gaze direct. "Saul," she began, her voice low. "I don't know how to be a wife." The words hung in the air, a confession of her deepest fear. She wasn't talking about cooking or cleaning. She was talking about the life her father had sold her into, the role she had been forced to play. She was telling him she could not be the meek, compliant woman he had paid for. After all they had been through, all they had survived, she was offering him the final, honest truth of who she was. Saul looked at her, at the strength and courage that radiated from her small frame, and a slow smile touched his lips for the first time in a long time. The thought of her being a simple, docile wife was absurd. He had no need for a servant. He had a partner. He reached out with his good hand, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. "Then just love me," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, but this time, it was not a tear of fear or sorrow. It was a tear of release, of a profound and overwhelming relief. She leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance, a quiet promise made in the heart of the mountains, under a canopy of stars, a new home rising from the ashes behind them.